Hello. Our story begins with the unending waltz of politics. The Jedi Temple had been bombed. People were dead. Families lost someone they loved, and it was turned into a chance for people to bash the Jedi. That was, in of itself, the galactic tragedy for the government. Could they take a moment to memorialize death? Had the concept of death become too common, and thus lost the reality of what it meant? Or could the people already dead be used for political discourse? Maybe the government will think deeply about how sad things are but never change it. As is the cycle of the Republic, is it not? What's right and what's wrong, only just discussions on a spectrum that the Jedi now sat in the middle of again. If it wasn't one thing, it was another for the Order, and now they're being blamed politically, ethically, and morally for something they had no control over. The true tragedy of the Temple bombing was that it directly affected the lives of Republic citizens. Former Jedi that didn't make it into the Order often found themselves working inside the hangar. Some of the dead were once younglings, and it was a direct reminder for the Jedi Council to consider what they were doing to their young. This was not a battle, but it was as close as they could get to losing their own children because of their political position, that being their siding with the Republic in a galactic-scale war. Now, the Jedi surprisingly didn't really jump to the conclusion that the Separatists could be behind this. You know, the faction that famously disrupted peace talks to bomb the Coruscant power grid? No, the Jedi went straight for the throat, because Ahsoka Tano, who wasn't on Coruscant during the bombing, possibly was involved. Maybe we're all being a little facetious because why not, but at this current point in the investigation, Letta Thurman had been killed. One of their prized Padawans happened to be in the room of that murder, and because Ahsoka also famously used the dark side so much in front of the Council, they believed certified Jedi hater Will Huff Tarkin instead of her. Truly a brilliant collection of elders. While the Council spent its time breaking its own back to clean the feet of the Chancellor and his greedy allies, Anakin was off doing what they should have been doing, searching for the real culprit. However, there was another individual providing to this investigation, that being one actually responsible for all the destruction. Barriss Offee was one of the several troubled minds inside the Jedi Order. She, like Ahsoka, had been trained to respect the Force and to serve the people of the galaxy. More than her friend, Barriss faced a much stricter training regiment, thanks to Miralan Jedi Master Luminara Unduli. The Miralans typically were a more religious people inside the Order, as seen with generations of great Jedi such as Katri, Venestra, and Jari Ozez. Barriss struggled with this regiment because Luminara could be especially hard, and even condescending. The Padawan reacted out of frustration because her master demanded perfection, excellence, and no emotion. But killing is emotional. Even if they were destroying battle droids, there had been death on their hands. It wears one down, forces them to think deeply about morality. Of course, somehow that led to Barriss bombing a temple full of innocent lives, but you know, we all deal with trauma differently. Some of us just prefer to nuke a hangar bay with nanobots because it's kinda funny. Padawan Offee, aside from the struggle of the war, had a realization after Ahsoka was apprehended by Commander Fox and Tarkin. She didn't see how the Palpatine loyalist treated her friend inside of her cell, but she did know that Ahsoka was not an intended casualty for this. The Jedi Council was once again showing their ignorance by not standing with one of their own, and Barriss didn't want her friend to pay the price for her actions. So she started to think about how she could make things right. Instead of going into the Republic prison complex to further make things worse for Ahsoka, she decided to simply visit her friend, see where Ahsoka's mind was at, and what she might know. Once Barriss arrived, she found Ahsoka in especially low spirits. While neither of them knew it, this was entirely a breach of protocol that no one meant to allow. Because Tarkin considered the bombing of the Jedi Temple a Republic military operation, he told the shock troopers to restrict General Skywalker and any other masters of the High Council from visiting. He meant to tell Commander Fox that no Jedi should be allowed inside of Ahsoka's cell, but he only covered people that he believed would visit Prisoner Tano. Tarkin interacted with Barriss for a few moments inside the temple, but it wasn't long enough of a conversation for him to even remember her or assumed that she'd be first in line to visit Ahsoka. So technically it was a breach, but realistically it was a mistake in Tarkin's communication of orders to the clones. Regardless, Barriss and Ahsoka sat down side by side inside the cell and discussed everything that had transpired. Offee didn't want to clue her friend into the fact that she had accidentally put her in prison. She instead directed the focus of their conversation to how this could happen. Despite being in low spirits about pretty much everything, Ahsoka still trusted the High Council. They were still in the middle of discussions to decide if Ahsoka should remain inside the Order or not. The vote had not been cast, and so both Padawans were stuck speaking about how to get her out of the situation. Barriss didn't have any key details that might help her friend either, making the conversation almost dreadful for Ahsoka. It didn't make anything better knowing that Tarkin had a distaste for the Jedi in general, and that was the perfect chance for him to frame them politically as incompetent. Ahsoka, though, told her friend that she had trust in the Council to make the right decision. They would back her because they knew she wouldn't do this. Ahsoka was completely certain about that, and she made it clear to Barriss. But Offee seemed to think differently. She immediately rejected Ahsoka's trust in the Council, suspecting that they could have had a secret weapon and accidentally released it on their own people. A little bit of tension started to arise over this conversation. Ahsoka clearly positioned herself on the side of the High Council, while Barriss tried to distance herself from their influence. Their conversation more or less revolved around how responsible the Council was for the accident inside the hangar bay, which is what Ahsoka thought it was. Letta made a mistake. She acted out of anger and people died. It was not a true act of war by the Separatists. It was someone who didn't understand the ramifications of conflict. Barriss, in knowing the truth and the reasoning behind the bombing, explained to Ahsoka that the Jedi Council was behind the attack the moment they sent 200 volunteers to Geonosis. The detonation was set to happen on that very day. This anger towards the Council wasn't something Ahsoka had ever seen from her friend before. It didn't lead to her thinking that Barriss was behind the attack, but it was a very weird hill to try and die on. Barriss implored that Ahsoka look for someone else's support, because she could almost guarantee that the elders would choose themselves over her. If they needed to expel someone for political favorability in the eyes of the Chancellor, they would do it. To Ahsoka, her friend looked completely disillusioned. Where was this coming from? Barriss had seen the Jedi in her life step away from their responsibilities to the people. They picked a side. It's why she was so certain that the attack on Geonosis set destiny into motion. Once they started an open war against the Separatists by attacking that arena, which yes, Barriss participated in, but clearly regretted, they announced to the galaxy that they were willing to accept an attack against themselves. She at this time was just an 18-year-old Padawan, doing exactly what Anakin was doing inside that arena, which they both believed was right, saving their brothers in Obi-Wan and Anakin, and Senator Padme Amidala from execution. What followed was a far greater consequence that she could have never predicted. Offee explained her theories to Ahsoka, suggesting that the High Council was at fault for all of this. They may have not directly bombed the hangar bay as she initially suggested they did with an outrageous secret technology, but instead she went with they caused it through their complacency and hubris. They owed the people of the galaxy an explanation for why they joined a war they had no part in. They abandoned an entire half of the galaxy for pride, and of course a few bones that the Republic might throw them. Ahsoka sat back inside the cell and powdered her face in annoyance. She wasn't only captured for a murder she did not commit, but she also had to sit here and listen to the ramblings of a friend who had gone off the deep end. This isn't to say that Ahsoka loved the High Council or all of their decisions, that'd be outrageous even for her. But she was her master's Padawan. He had his problems with the collection of elders, whereas Ahsoka saw Masters Plo and Obi-Wan as friends, and respectable individuals that cared about everyone. She had closer relationships with members on the council than Barriss did. But if her friend was so frustrated, and she asked this audibly, then why didn't she put any blame on the Republic? The Jedi were flawed, sure, and their leadership had clearly put them into a bind, but how could Barriss openly blame the High Council but neglect the influence of the Chancellor? Offee straightened her back for a moment. All of her frustrations she just verbally put against the council vanished, and she considered if she had targeted something or someone else. There were so many possibilities. What if she bombed the Senate building or Palpatine's office? Or what if I shamelessly plugged 2 videos by accident? She'd be a fool to think that the Jedi were responsible for all the wrong in the galaxy. It was a sick realization, and one that made her stomach turn. Barriss killed well over a dozen people for nothing. Her attack wasn't a representation of the desire for change. If she had targeted the High Council chambers, that could have made a difference. But she murdered everyday people, just worker bees. And that was the truth. Just like her friend Ahsoka, despite her plot armor, she was just an everyday person. The people with real influence on this war and the catastrophes that continued on systems across the galaxy were the Elders, the Senate, and most importantly, the Chancellor, not people that worked inside the hangar, and not Ahsoka. Ahsoka was still a youngling when Palpatine received his emergency powers from the Senate due to the Separatist crisis he created. Barriss was not a youngling. She was a Padawan, and part of Luminar's rigorous curriculum, and she had to pay attention to important news articles in the galaxy. Palpatine's name was always present, not John Maintenance inside the hangar bay. The Supreme Chancellor had it in the name, his supreme influence. Ahsoka asked her friend why she suddenly stopped speaking, and Barriss shook her head. She was sorry, she didn't mean to barge in here and ramble about the High Council. That was wrong of her. Barriss expressed openly that she was just tired of the war, and she feared what might happen to Ahsoka because of it, and then, of course, the Council. Offee simply wanted her friend to be freed, and she externalized her frustrations in an unhealthy way. For that, she was deeply sorry. Ahsoka had no problem forgiving her friend because it happens. She was equally as frustrated, but they had the trust that the High Council would do the right thing. At the same time, just before Barriss could leave, Anakin was rejected access to Ahsoka's cell. Commander Fox pissed off General Skywalker, but orders are orders, and Captain Tarkin had full control over this case because of Palpatine. While Anakin didn't know that much, he'd be forced to leave the structure just minutes before Barriss walked out of the cell. After Padawan Offee left, Fox made an adjustment to Tarkin's commands, because he believed that maybe the orders were meant for all Jedi, not just Masters on the Council or pissing off Skywalker. It was a simple error that he quickly reported to the Republic captain. On the surface, to Tarkin, it was just a simple mistake, so he didn't really care. But realistically, it was perhaps one of the worst internal breaches the Republic could ever hope for. Barriss left the Republic prison complex, motivated and even more irritated. She understood that mistakes had been made, and she was partial to them. No longer could she just throw blame at the High Council as if her own actions didn't bring consequences to innocent, undeserving casualties. She walked out of the structure with a decision, a change of mindset. Barriss didn't know how it would work, but she wouldn't force her friend to become a victim of a mistake. Someone responsible for so much carnage needed to go down. Thanks to her connection to everything, and the fact that she was the actual perpetrator, she went back to the drawing board in the lower levels of Coruscant. Her arrival to the warehouse saw the return of angst and disgust with the system, and now even more than that, herself. Barriss hated herself, viscerally. It was a foolish decision that never should have been done to the hangar. It had to have been an important target, and that wasn't one. A Republic cruiser may have changed things, but no. She killed so many innocents for absolutely nothing. It was too late too. The bulk of the nanobots had been used, and she didn't really have the means of acquiring more. It was a one-and-done type of mission. She only had some evidence left behind on the register of the warehouse. Then, her train of rampant, tumultuous thought came to a standstill. She had so many ideas and decisions to contemplate, and then she looked at the registry for the building, and whose name was on it? No one's. It was a completely unlisted structure and had been that way since 3 years before the Clone War, in 25 BBY. Yes, I know the Death Star hadn't happened yet, but we all know the unit of time, BBY, so it was 25 BBY. Barriss looked through the manifest, seeing business transactions and so forth, and then she realized something. The building technically didn't go into the underground registry as an abandoned location. It was just completely off the records. because the previous owner of the warehouse had a certain interest in cartel work. Quickly, Barriss started to think about how to best utilize this information. If this building was off the records, then technically, anyone could be a business owner. The only reason no one had quote-unquote owned this building for a little under 5 years was because the mob boss died. So all the shipments were removed by his allies, and it became a hodgepodge of shipments between different cartels that negotiated territory inside the building. The mayor of the underground level was on their payroll, so he never had any intention to tear down the building or to make it official property of anyone's. So, if no one technically owned it, Barriss, if she got a hold of the right credentials, could technically frame someone else as the operator of the nanobots. Not just that, but she had contacts inside Aleda's family that could be very upset with the Republic for covering up their family member's murder. Yeah, she felt a little bad about doing that to Leda, but maybe it was a good thing, a sacrifice for the greater good. Thanks to night falling on the Republic capital, Barriss used the skills she used to get into the Republic military complex on the executive building. If she could sneak into a maximum security prison and kill Leda, then getting into Palpatine's office should be a no-brainer. Barriss narrowed her choices down to Lot Dot of the Federation, Sam of the Techno Union, Nix Card of the Banking Clans, and Chancellor Palpatine. At the end, it was between Nix and Palpatine. She went with the latter, because of the amount of potential change it could bring. Also because they were running security checks on the Senate building, not the executive building. It was a routine thing. Now, to clarify, Barriss didn't have high hopes in the High Council. She really didn't even believe that they could be helpful in this at all. But Ahsoka had given her just a last little bit of hope, something to push her far enough to doing something incredibly dangerous. Sneaking into Palpatine's office and breaking into his executive console wasn't easy work, and it took hours of the night for her to complete. But Barriss was able to go back and gather information from Palpatine's credentials in 25 BBY, so she could quote-unquote purchase this warehouse from his account. Again, it was all free territory, but she could change things up as need be with his credentials. All she really needed was that information, and she could do the rest. With another trip taking her back to the lower levels at sunrise, Barriss got to work again. Firstly, she put Palpatine's name on the records, and then, because it was a warehouse, she framed certain purchases and shipments that never existed. She went through all of her notes from Luminar's instruction, news articles about things the Chancellor was doing publicly, and how things played out because of his actions were used. For example, a policy that forced Raxus to secede was a trade route restriction on minor commerce, basically providing the Techno Union with a monopoly on a hyperspace lane. That policy related to a shipping disaster because of the Techno Union. It was mostly covered up despite making the headlines, but she framed the accident as intentional because of Palpatine. Barriss obviously didn't know how involved the Chancellor really was with everything leading up to the Separatist crisis, but she made it look like he was more a participant than he really was on the surface. This was a Sith Lord after all, so he never would associate himself with these accidents. That's why bounty hunters, Dooku, assassins, and several other forms of contracts were paid for and signed for this to happen. So while yes, for this specific example, he was an active participant, he wasn't directly connected to it as Chancellor Palpatine aside from the policy. That was the irony. Barriss was connecting Sidious to Palpatine without any knowledge of doing it. And throughout the entire day, as the High Council continued to struggle on their vote against Ahsoka, with Tarkin breathing down their neck, Padawan Offee filled out every report she could find. Not even that, but she cleared the code so that all the data looked like it was actually input on those days or around them years ago. It made everything look legitimate, because the record said it was. Barriss was also operating off of no sleep, and the last of her energy was depleting. This was also one of Luminar's lessons to her. It was a conservation of energy so that one could best use it for a longer period of time, more evenly spread out. This provided Barriss with one more opportunity to get the warehouse information to the High Council, and she would do so by laying an accidental trap for one of its members. Someone close to Ahsoka, Plo Koon. Master Plo would be tipped off by one of Leda's family members that there was a location that Leda used that might be effective. How the civilians got a hold of close contact information, he didn't know, but he used it. After informing his peers, he quickly descended into the lower levels of the city, while Barriss slept in a meditative state. To avoid all potential chance at being connected, Luminar would unknowingly participate in Barriss's second plot. She'd find her student meditating, and assume that she had put herself in that state ever since her visit with Ahsoka the previous day. Master Unduli never woke her student up. She let her be because this was evidence that her instruction was working. Offee was a good student, Luminar knew that, and she was prideful in her Padawan's efforts to harmonize with the Force in such a hard time. Master Plo, on the other hand, would slip down into the location. The warehouse was hard for him to walk around in. The structure was falling apart, and he was a heavier guy, little muscular, and it was hard to walk around inside of the building because it could fall apart. He had to be careful, and it almost led to him requesting for someone else, lighter, to go in. But eventually he found the control console, and it led to him collecting all the damning information. With the vote to remove Ahsoka from the Order coming in the next few hours, Plo quickly rushed this information back to his peers on the Council. It was deeply troubling, and he worried for what repercussions of such information would have for the Republic and potentially the galaxy. This, though, angered the Keldor Jedi. One of his closest friends, Padawan Tano, was framed by the Supreme Chancellor. Many members of the High Council had their frustrations with the crumbling relationship between the Order and the government, but never did they think that it would come to this. A targeted attack meant to make them look like the villains of their own home. They firstly didn't know why Palpatine thought that the people would blame them for bombing their own hangar bay, but people did, so they guessed that Palpatine wasn't technically wrong about that. However, all talks of Ahsoka disappeared, and they went into a several-hour discussion about how to approach this, and their resolve would be petty. There's simply no other way to say it. The Jedi didn't first approach Palpatine. They leaked the information to the tabloids. Palpatine may have had complete control over the media, because an elected official controlling the media is always a good idea, but Palpatine couldn't stop them from taking bait this big. This was information that could generate generational wealth for them. It was a story so big that it could turn the Republic upside down, and so the tabloids, famously known for their incredible timing, released the information right as Palpatine was making a speech inside the Senate. He was unable to stop it because he didn't know. He would actually be the last individual inside the rotunda to learn of it, because he was speaking. It was a total eruption inside the Republic. How could the Chancellor do this to the Jedi? It wasn't just wrong, it was unethical. But the worst had yet to come. The Jedi recognized that due to their unpopularity, any move they made would make them look worse. For example, their temple got bombed, and then people protested outside of it, like, okay, sure, that makes sense. The Jedi would bomb themselves for the lulz and lamals. That brought the Council to the decision about Palpatine. The corrupt Senate wouldn't turn on him, the clones likely wouldn't, so the Jedi had to make the sacrifice themselves. A team of 8 temple guards with Masters Windu and Plo would arrive at the Senate building to officially arrest Palpatine on behalf of the Republic and the status of war in the galaxy. The Senate commandos didn't necessarily stop them. Most commandos came from outlying systems affected by the war anyways. They weren't going to protect someone behind an attack on not just the Jedi Temple, but the planned failures of the government to prevent the war. These commandos provided a path for the Jedi to make it to the Chancellor, and then to their transport, where they would escort Palpatine back to the temple. The Supreme Chancellor made no scene. He simply allowed the tabloids to get a shot of him being escorted by the temple guards. Hopefully, something they'd call a Jedi hostile takeover. And he was right. Even though people were appalled by the report, which confirmed everything from things that happened in 25 BBY up to the attack on the temple, people also didn't like the idea of the Jedi taking matters into their own hands. They were still technically the enemy to a lot of people, and they were exercising a power they did not have over the Chancellor. Well, the Jedi put out an official statement condoning Palpatine's attack on their temple, but even worse, his attempts to divide the galaxy into civil war. Knowing that the courts wouldn't hold an honest trial, they were withholding him from being sent there. Instead, they'd conduct a public investigation with assistance from the Senate. if they were capable of handling the dissolution of corruption. The Jedi became everyone's biggest target, except for one faction, the Separatists. That was a big change for the Jedi, ironically. Many of the Separatist senators were outraged over Palpatine's decision to split the Republic, and while it was clear that the chance for reunification was gone, following Mina Bontiri's assassination, the concept of the entire Republic being to blame slowly vanished. Palpatine was the villain. And there was also a changing perception on the Jedi Order. They were seen in propaganda as servants of the Senate, just as Dooku liked to portray them. This clearly was a different story though. They openly betrayed the Chancellor and stood on the side of justice. It didn't turn heads for people inside the Confederacy, but it made them wonder if a ceasefire could come without Palpatine in office. Despite all the attention going to Palpatine, Ahsoka had to remain in prison. Tarkin tried to use her as leverage against the Jedi Order, and this forced her master to have a very difficult choice. Anakin was furious, first at Fox, then Tarkin, then the Jedi, then Palpatine. It was a revolving door of people to be upset with, but each of them valid. Skywalker didn't want Ahsoka to sit in prison throughout this process. She didn't deserve that. While Barriss had gone radio silent since leaking the information to the Jedi, Anakin had no updates about his Padawan. She was alive, he knew that, but Tarkin was trying to force the Jedi to negotiate for her. Anakin wanted her free, but the Council wouldn't budge. Palpatine was a target they needed to take down. That was again another problem for Anakin. He didn't believe that his mentor friend was capable of such heinous actions. Yet all the proof was there. The records from the warehouse held the truth. And now, the Sith Lord quietly sat in prison inside the Jedi Temple, waiting for someone to make the right move for him. Who would it be? Would the Separatists attack the apparently weak Coruscant? Would the Senate support him? How might the Jedi treat him if things didn't go their way? Well, all that came to a resolution with Senator Amidala. This would also add to Anakin's list of things to be upset with. Padme believed that Palpatine's imprisonment was a chance to unite the galaxy to stop the war. Not that a peace treaty would come, but a chance for a ceasefire, which is what she wanted. She reached out to her allies across the Senate, and quickly formed a movement in the hours after the Jedi captured the Chancellor. Immediately after, they reached out to Separatist loyalists that were willing to communicate with Republic officials. A deal was sorted out following the Jedi announcement revealing that they wouldn't put Palpatine inside the courts on Coruscant. Judging off of how easily an oligarch like Gunray was able to get away with the blockade over Naboo, they weren't going to let the courts that Palpatine filled review his case. That would be suicide. Senator Amidala's combined coalition included the likes of various members of support, the government of Mon Calamari, Cham Syndulla, the people of Pantora, and so many more. The Separatists defied Count Dooku's demands to cease and desist, because an end to battle was a step in the right direction. Remember, the Separatists really only wanted independence. They weren't all totally war-hungry sycophants like Dooku. If this was a path to peace, and then independence, they would take it. Dooku trying to stand in the way of that turned some of his fiercest supporters away from him. Not total betrayal, not that far, just an open distrust for his intentions with their government and movement as a whole. As the hours into days passed by since the arrest, a coalition formed between neutral systems trying to reopen commerce in the galaxy, Republic representatives demanding the truth, and Separatist senators requesting an end to the conflict. The war had overstayed its welcome, and Dooku, curious to see the result, actually decided to let it play out. He knew that if a majority movement inside of his own government formed, he couldn't legitimately oppose it without losing his own support. So he allowed it, pulling back troops and giving Grievous direct orders in case things went awry. In other words, Grievous wasn't meant to do anything until Dooku gave him orders to do something. The Jedi faced harsher protests inside the capital, as Mas Amedda demanded an emergency session to turn the clones against the Jedi. It didn't work. Yes, people inside the Senate were upset with the Jedi. It was also legally irresponsible to side with the Chancellor, though. A lot of this was about control inside the Senate. Even though everyone loved Palpatine and gave him emergency powers, the Chancellor could not, legally, bomb an entity inside the capital of the Republic without government authority. It was an abuse of executive powers, and even those who supported the Chancellor did not excuse this behavior. Again, this was only because of power. If this didn't challenge the individual authority of every voice inside the Senate, chances are they would have forced the vote to turn the clones against the Jedi. But because the individual senators wanted their voices to still have meaning, they refused to turn the clones against the Jedi, and allowed the Order to continue the investigation and incoming court case. With protection from the government, the Council made arrangements with the Coalition to find neutral territory for a court case. It came with a ton of strings to be pulled and so forth, but Corellia became the location. It wasn't neutral territory, it was just protected enough and close enough for everyone of every side to visit. In the meantime, though, the Jedi dispatched a collection of Jedi under Terra Sanube's command to continue investigating the Chancellor. This was also a breach of the Republic. They were not permitted to continue while the court case ensued, but the Jedi were suspicious because they wanted to know how deep this really went. None of them theorized that he could be a Sith or that he had involvement with the cloning facilities on Kamino. But there was a concept suggested by Obi-Wan that Palpatine might be involved with the blockade over Naboo. It was plausible too. He ascended right in the middle of that invasion. His hands could be all over it. For days, going into weeks, the war hit a standstill. Tarkin lost control over Ahsoka as the court case went to a higher neutral authority. Because Senator Amidala sat on that committee, seen as a neutral voice because she came from Naboo, she was able to make a case for Ahsoka's freedom. Ahsoka clearly didn't bomb the temple, clearly didn't murder Letta. The Jedi took care of their Padawan and made her a knight for handling the ordeal with patience and maturity. They apologized for not having done anything, despite believing that she didn't murder Letta. In all actuality, side tangent real quick, everyone forgot about Letta. She was just an unsung hero for Palpatine's arrest, by accident, and she was forgotten. Tarkin didn't care about her because she was leverage to forcing the Jedi out of power. The Jedi forgot because they didn't really care. Palpatine was the target right now, and that's why she was forgotten, because of Palpatine. Regardless, with the constant bickering inside the neutral court on Corellia, both governments moved their militaries. It wasn't a secret either. Spies were monitoring fleet movements and troop garrison refills. It was all in the open, just pieces on a board without starting any conflict. The Jedi Council sat in court, adding what they continued to find, which really didn't amount to anything important for the case. They did learn more about Palpatine's affiliation with the Sith, but it wasn't relevant to the courts, so it never came up. Instead, the push inside the discussions came to a head nearly a full month after the ceasefire started, with Palpatine being found guilty of attacking the Jedi Temple and being the main perpetrator behind the Clone War. He was being sentenced to a life in maximum security prison, basically a white soundproof box. The silent chamber, they called it. Palpatine actually couldn't believe it. What he couldn't believe more was that Dooku wasn't doing anything to help him. Tyrannus was also in a weird bind. He knew that if he continued the war at this point, he likely wouldn't live long enough to see its conclusion. Specifically, a war where he was actually fighting and not manipulating from both sides, meaning that Grievous would probably destroy the galaxy and turn everything Dooku worked so hard for upside down. Tyrannus allowed the case to play out naturally because if the Separatists could gain independence, then his life's legacy would mean something. He'd make a difference, which is what he set out to do, not to serve Sidious. However, despite the sentence for Palpatine coming through, the former Chancellor had other plans. The moment his sentencing was set in stone, he started scheming. This carried on through his head all the way out of the court building on Corellia to the transport to his new prison. He kept his head down, away from the tabloids and camera blasts, when through the blinding array of lights, a clone trooper from the 24th Nova Corps walked up the steps. As a member of the Galactic Marines, he and his division, his brothers, had seen some of the worst the war had thrown at them, and so he pulled out a slug thrower scattergun, calling Palpatine a mass murderer and pumping his guts full of hot energy. The clone refused to be pulled away, firing twice more after the initial shot, and then finally watching the former Chancellor fall to his knees as temple guards apprehended the clone. Surprisingly, Palpatine was still alive, he was quickly transported to a local hospital, but wouldn't survive the journey. Unfortunately, with the likes of Mace Windu and the temple guards around him during their airlift to the hospital, he never had a chance to break free. Some would speculate if the Jedi ensured that he died on the transport, but all signs would point to the clone who murdered him. The council pulled back to Coruscant, where protesters still stood outside the temple. On the galactic stage, though, the court hearing at Corellia changed everything. It forced both sides of the war into a room to talk about their differences. Not intentionally, just because they were removing Palpatine from power. And if you're wondering why the Senate didn't declare open war again, well, one of their own men killed the Chancellor. This collaborative effort inside the court, though, and a lack of push from either side, led to the opening of peace talks. The galaxy was already experiencing a ceasefire for a full month, so why not try and end it all in one go? The truth is, people were tired of the war. It's why the Jedi were faced with blame from the public after they were bombed by the Chancellor. The Jedi didn't really involve themselves with this process either, and instead stuck to themselves on Coruscant. A representative or two from the council would participate, but Dooku wouldn't want them present. He wasn't going to demand their destruction, he just wanted them removed from the political discourse because they were a religion, not a government. They did not belong inside discussions that shaped the galaxy. Legal documents define how a government leads, not the texts of a group that sought to hold influence on the galactic stage through the Republic. That's what Dooku said to everyone, and they stuck with it. Despite his interests in a galactic empire, Tyrannus decided that with the Sith Lord dead, he would etch his legacy into the cosmos, not as a Sith, but a politician. He'd step away from the war and assist two governments with reaching a deal. Grievous would remain the leader, but instead be tasked with capturing territory in the Outer Rim for CIS expansion. The Republic eventually would emulate that. It would turn from a war between governments into conflicts with criminal empires. This would help the Confederacy with growing exponentially overnight in size, and the Republic never really caught up with the growth afterwards. Maul would be dealt with by a trio of Obi-Wan, Anakin, and Jedi Knight Ahsoka Tano, but Mandalore would fall to the Republic, because without Satine, it was politically fractured. Barriss and Ahsoka eventually formed a new adoration for the Jedi, because the Order, following Mandalore, shifted focus. They had done a disservice to themselves by siding with the Republic, and had to make amends with the people in the galaxy. It would take time, but eventually 90% of the Order would leave Coruscant for neutral Tython, and become the People's Entity, a religious sect that protected, served, and aided everyone in the galaxy. They were not politicians. The result of the peace treaty was competition. Tension remained. Flares for conflict would come, but all-out war would never be the result. The Confederacy and the Republic, instead, because of their vying for influence in the galaxy, fought to maintain the interests of their people instead of lobbyists. The Republic tried to prove that they were the right government for the people in the galaxy, while the Confederacy provided cases for their system and its functionality. What mattered in the end, though, was that the governments actually focused on their people. No longer were CEOs dictating the formation of bills. No longer were the elite profiting off of suffering. No longer did people settle for nothing from their representatives. Dooku's legacy, ironically, would be that. A villain turned hero in a galaxy rapidly shifting towards a positive future with two strong governments. And that, my friends, is our story. Again, special thanks to all the patrons for supporting the channel. Smash that like button. Let's talk about the story. This one, I love these stories, I'm not gonna lie. Barriss is a fun character to work with. She's like semi-flawed, but fascinating because I feel like a lot of her flaws come from Luminar's training. I think Luminar was just really hard on her. And I don't think Luminar's a bad teacher either. I think Luminar's a bad wartime teacher. I think that's the difference. And that's kind of where the story goes, is that the influence of Luminar is very present in the story, and if it wasn't for Luminar, I don't think this story works. Having Luminar force, Barriss to do all these, I guess you would call them book reports or essays on galactic news is why Barriss is able to get to that conclusion about Palpatine. I really liked the concept of the Jedi blaming Palpatine because of Barriss. I felt like that kind of needed to be the resolution, because if you don't have like Barriss doing something, she's kind of just like, I bombed the temple, haha, and then the Jedi doing something which isn't totally out of character for them, that is just batshit insane, like, oh yeah, he did it. Like, yeah, they did it with Ahsoka, so I mean, it could be that way, but I kind of wanted to give them a reasoning for following that direction, and I think Barriss being that catalyst is very important here. I liked the concept of Dooku kind of being a neutral force in this story. You really can go anywhere with Dooku in these stories, which is really why he's so fun to write, especially in my opinion, why I loved writing him, because you really can go anywhere with him. It doesn't matter if he's a Jedi, a Sith, it doesn't matter what era either. You could do, you know, late High Republic, like the 80s, or you could do, you know, Clone War era, and there's always something new he has to offer. And in this one, I really liked the idea of him seeing Palpatine get arrested and thinking to himself, okay, well, maybe I can take advantage of this. And I also wanted to model Palpatine's death off of, like, I think it's, what the hell is his name? Oswald, the guy that killed JFK. I really thought that'd be kind of an interesting kind of parallel. It's like he's getting these pictures taken, and then boom, he's fucking dead. Like a fucking dead guy. They just shot in the face. And so I thought that, you know, having a Galactic Marine, I was up in the air about a Galactic Marine and a Wolfpack member, because both units got devastated. But I ended up going with the Nova Corps, because they're so cool and they look cool. So that's what I did, because they're cool. And then finally, like, the last thing, the reason the war really comes to an end, in my opinion, is because the ceasefire is long enough that people kind of remember what it's like to not have war. And that really kind of, like, gets them going. They're like, yeah, I like this. I don't like having to worry about clone armies or droid armies. I like just knowing that, sure, they're out there, but they're not coming to my doorstep. And that really is the resolution. The resolution is that the armies aren't going to come for you. It's over. It's done with. Let's just move on. And I kind of like that Dooku kind of becomes a hero in this, because he gets to be what he wanted to be the whole time. So I hope you all enjoyed this story. I love you all. Spread the love, and always, my friends, may the Force be with you.